Good afternoon. We're going to be getting started now. My name is Enrique Desmond Arias. I am the Marx Chair of Western Hemisphere Affairs at Baruch College and a professor of political science at the City University of New York Graduate Center. As a reminder to our audience today, please mute your microphones so we don't get excess background noise prior to the discussion, the question and answer session portion of our conversation today. And also the Bildner Center will be recording this event for future dissemination. So please keep that in mind as you participate in our event. Across the Americas, countries as diverse as the United States, Brazil, Venezuela, Ecuador, and El Salvador have elected populist leaders on both the left and the right who have posed significant challenges to democratic order and the rule of law. At the same time, a number of these political leaders have raised questions about the directions that their countries are going in and how to address them that are critical of previous responses. Countries throughout the region have also faced meaningful challenges, building equitable economies, addressing transnational migration, and confronting chronically elevated levels of criminal violence due to robust illicit markets and ready access to firearms. Perhaps nowhere in the Americas do these various dynamics come together more clearly than in Mexico today. In 2018, the country elected Andrés Manuel López Obrador, the leader of the Morena party, as president with a remarkable 15% of the popular vote in a four-way race in which his closest competitor, Ricardo Anaya of the PAN, Partido Acción Nacional party, winning only 23% of the vote. All of this occurred during a high turnout election. The election was all the more remarkable in that it represented the election of a candidate clearly on the left of the political spectrum for the first time since the transition to democracy 20 years ago. During his term in office, President López Obrador has raised important questions about economic equity and equality before the law as part of his concept of the fourth transformation of Mexican politics, which follows on the 19th century War of Independence, the Reform War, and the Mexican Revolution. He has sought to do so through policy reforms, but also through disruptive rhetoric, focusing public ire on the mafia in power. President López Obrador has challenged Mexican institutions that seek to provide a level playing field and shore up democracy in the country and build civic life. He has sought to push opponents out of high-level judicial appointments and appoint allies to the judiciary. This has also included attacks and reduction in funding to the Instituto Nacional de Elecciones, the National Electoral Institute, and seeking to abolish the Instituto Nacional para Acceso a la Información, the National Institute for the Access to Information. He has attacked NGOs, universities, and the media. He has sought to extend executive control over trust funds designed to support universities and the arts, to expand presidential control over these institutions. This conversation about Mexico will address the unique political juncture that Mexico finds itself in, assessing the policies of President López Obrador and considering the real challenges that Mexico faces in managing domestic security, protecting democratic governance, and dealing with an increasingly complex foreign policy environment. We have the privilege today of bringing together three leading scholars of Mexico to help us in this conversation. The first is Rafael Fernández de Castro, who is a professor of the Aaron Feldman Family Chancellor's Endowed Chair at in the U.S. Mexican Studies Center at the University of California, San Diego. He is a former foreign policy advisor to President Felipe Calderón. He is an expert on bilateral relations between Mexico and the US. He has published numerous academic articles and written several books, including Contemporary US Latin American Relations, Cooperation or Conflict in the 21st Century, and the United States and Mexico Between Partnership and Conflict. Sandra is associate professor in the Political Studies Division at the Centro de Investigación y Docencia Económicas, CIDE, in Mexico City, where she also coordinates the program for the study of violence. Her research analyzes the impact of criminal violence on the exercise of democratic citizenship in Latin America, with central emphasis on Mexico. She co-authored Votes, Drugs, and Violence, the political logic of criminal wars in Mexico with Guillermo Trejo at Cambridge University Press. Mariano Sánchez-Talanquer is assistant professor at the Centro de Estudios Internacionales of the Colegio de México. He has been an academy scholar at Harvard, at the Harvard Academy for International Area Studies, and an assistant professor of politics at the Center for Research and Teaching in at CIDE also. His interests include state building, democracy, inequality, and historical institutional development with a regional focus on Latin America. His current book project examines historical state formation in Mexico and Colombia to investigate the origins of territorial variation in several dimensions of state capacity. So I wanted to start out this conversation with a broad question of what do you see as the central directions that President López Obrador has taken Mexico in since he came to power in 2018? And I'm going to start with you, Professor Sánchez.
Thank you, Desmond. Thank you for the introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here. It's an honor to share the panel with Professors Rafael, Fernández de Castro, and Sandra. And so I would say, I mean, there are many layers to the question. Of course, it's a big question, and I think we can, at least analytically, think of two spheres. One is what has been going on at the level of the regime with democracy itself, and second, the kind of policies that the AMLO administration has been implementing. And I would like to, perhaps start with the first part of what AMLO has done in office in the past 3 years, and what's the balance so far about the current state and potentially the future of Mexican democracy. And I think we should start by saying that, before the 2018 elections, there were some questions about how AMLO would behave in power. There were perhaps some questions or some doubts about his democratic commitments. And I think so far, after 3 years in office, it's very clear that, we have evidence that the government is willing to use the government apparatus and to use office to try to secure a permanent advantage, to secure competitive advantages, and to undermine at least some elements of the institutions that we consider essential for a liberal democracy. So I think that's an important premise and a starting point. We see that you mentioned some of the some examples of this, but I think it's a premise that needs to be defended and that needs to be explained to our audience. And so thinking back on, there's a classic literature on democratic transitions that spoke about the problems of a semi-loyal opposition, but now it's it's clear that in Mexico and other countries in the world, democracy is under threat because of facing the challenge of what to do with semi-loyal, when not disloyal, democratic incumbents. And I think this is, this situates Mexico in a broader, in an international context. Democracy is not doing well, I would say, elsewhere in the world, and this international context we know matters for regime dynamics. And so an analysis of the state of democracy needs to start with that, right? The executive rejects constitutional limitations on its authority and redistributes power toward itself in the name of the people. And ideally, democratic stability would rest on the normative commitment of both political elites and society broadly to the democratic game, but we know that that is often too much to ask, and I think it is too much to ask in this case. And even in advanced democracy, we're seeing the rise of these authoritarian personalities and movements that are challenging, especially the liberal component of democracy. And so the question is, the political conundrum is whether it's possible to sustain a liberal democratic regime when the people in power are not committed liberal Democrats themselves. And what has the AMLO administration done, and what I see are the main potential risks and violations. First is what's been going on at the institutional level in the relationship between the executive and the different branches of government and of different political institutions within the state. AMLO has embarked on a project to, I see, expand the discretionary power of the presidency, and implicitly or explicitly sometimes arguing that other institutions have been captured by elite interests and that fragmentation of power plays into the hands of rent-seeking, corrupt elite interests. And so I am here speaking here of concrete actions to elevate the presidency above other branches of government, above other institutions, and to really try to sort of domesticate autonomous centers of power, both in the state and in civil society. And so measures here are varied. They include the partisan political use of the government spending, austerity cuts, fast-track decrees that sort of contradict or supersede constitutional norms and ordinary legislation and others. And so these measures span the courts, the bureaucracy, autonomous regulatory agencies, state governments, universities, so on and so forth. So I don't think there is a preconceived master plan. Many of these measures are very reactive and made on the fly, but they have a common denominator and a common logic, which is subordinating these autonomous centers of power to the presidency. And secondly, and I'll leave it, I'll pass I'll let others weigh in after this, but I think it's important to highlight that from the beginning, we're seeing for the first time, I think, under Mexican democracy, a president that is openly hostile to key democratic institutions. And I'm speaking specifically of IFE and the electoral courts. There's a constant harassment, efforts to delegitimize these institutions as part of the establishment, as corrupt. And we saw in the midterms and are seeing now in the referendum that is coming, a willingness from the executive to intervene in the electoral process that risks tilting the playing field and sort of moving towards a regime in which, the pre-transition to democracy regime in which the electoral game is not necessarily fair. The opposition faces this upward battle, and therefore it's hard to sustain or to speak properly of a democratic regime. I don't think we're there yet. Those are so clearly the risks, and I think there are potential reasons that we can expand upon on why that may be likely or may not be likely. I tend to be more optimistic than I think the average commentator, but I do think that that's the most important thing that we should mention about what AMLO has done in the past 3 years.
Thank you, Professor Sanchez. Professor Fernández de Castro, I wanted to ask you to address the same question, and in particular, comparing and contrasting President López Obrador's administration with regards to the practice of democracy with previous administrations like Peña Nieto or Calderón's.
Thank you, Desmond. I'm very happy to be here, and I owe you a lot. I traveled with Desmond to Brazil, and I learned a lot about Brazil and citizen security in Brazil, and I owe you, Desmond. Thank you very much, and I'm very happy to be here with Mariano and Sandra. Let me echo some of the things that already Mariano said. I would say, first of all, I believe we're experiencing the coming back of an imperial presidency in Mexico. Yes, AMLO is about power, is about accumulating lots of power in the hands of the president, But you asked me, what are the difference with the PRI? Well, I will say yes, during the 72-year tenure of the PRI in the Mexican presidency, I will say the president will have two very important tools to govern with: the cabinet and the official party, the PRI. And AMLO is different because he does use Morena a little bit. Morena is more a movement than an official party. It is very different. It's not as well structured as the party. But the main difference is that AMLO doesn't use the cabinet. He's basically taking decisions on his own. He never gets together with his cabinet members. When he does, it's like about, he's like if he were in mass, he's the bishop and the other ones are there and listening to him. So it's very special, is the accumulation of power in his persona. And something that I will say, try to explain, and Mariano is right, he's trying to diminish, if not destroy, some of these institutions, democratic institutions in Mexico. But why is he doing that? My read of his vision is the following, Desmond. I believe that he sees that power has diminished for the Mexican presidency, and that has happened in the last 20 years. I would say starting at the end of Salinas, but particularly, I mean, with the arrival of Fox in the year 2000, I mean, the presidency in Mexico, it was not what it used to be. And AMLO believes that that power has flowed into the very high-level bureaucrats, the head of Instituto INE, into the very important bureaucrats, into the hands of very important business persons. And he wants to recuperate that power for the presidency and for the president, because that is a way for him to then be able to perform his fourth transformation. So that is his sense. So he's basically trying to recuperate power in the hands of the presidency, because it's been the distribution of power nowadays. I mean, he doesn't buy that, and to me, it's fascinating to observe. I mean, how hard is he trying to get that power back into the presidency? And let me stay there. That's to me my take. It's someone again who takes very serious power, and is someone who doesn't really care about the deep state. On that sense, he's a populist. I mean, it's about himself. He disregards the experience of Mexican high-level bureaucrats. He disregards and he blames even technocrats, those who, like us, who have studied PhDs in international universities. He believes that we don't need that. So it's fascinating to observe. I mean, the differences between. I mean, he has in a way a DNA of a priista. But in the other hand, he doesn't need the cabinet to govern with, and he disregards expertise in the government, and it's about himself. So this is brand new, and of course we haven't seen these levels of power in at least in 30 decades, and no doubt that with his press conference every single morning, he is able to get directly into the people. I'm surprised how many Mexicans are looking at the mañaneras, how instrumental these everyday press briefings are for his handling of power, and I believe that we're under a new phenomena, which is amlismo, and there's already at least 10 fairly good books written on AMLO, but I will say there will be written hundreds of them, because it is very special, it's very unique, and it has a very different connotations from the power held by the old PRI. Thank you, Desmond.
Thank you, Rafael. Sandra, Professor Ley, I wanted to turn this question to you, and I want to shift it a little bit because your work is very granular and very local. And I wanted to ask you, so, you know, Rafael and Mariano have given this kind of higher level analysis of what's going on in Mexico, which I think is very important for understanding this perspective broadly. But on the ground, you know, in terms of what's going on in towns and neighborhoods, what does AMLO's administration and his different approaches and postures mean?
Thanks, Desmond. Again, I echo my colleagues and thanking you for the opportunity to share with you in this space. I think that precisely something that was very surprising from the way that the López Obrador administration, and I want to go back to Rafael's point that it's really not the administration, is the president, right, making decisions individually. After having visited so many municipalities across the country, right, that was part of his discourse before coming into power as the legitimate president, right, that he had been going throughout the country, visiting every single municipality, visiting a lot of towns and localities across Mexico, that after such deep immersion, right, across the territory, that the focus, nonetheless, once in power, is still guided by federal, right, national view. From if we talk about security, right, Desmond, the bet was on a national guard, right, not on building those capacities at the local level, not on how to work with those municipalities and to think about the skills that they needed and the equipment that was needed. However, I would say that the way that, if that's in terms of security, right, addressing the fact, right, that that's sort of the bias that I have from my own research agenda. But I think that I agree with Mariano that from if we go into the local, at the local level, the way that the government has addressed that, the localities, the towns, the people, has been through social agendas, right? Through the so-called social policy that is attempting to redistribute, having all these very local operators going house by house at some point, right, during the pandemic, trying to mobilize efforts and make a name for the new social efforts that were being done. However, and that was a main criticism that was done with the servidores de la nación at some point. However, this is done still with a national view, right? Not thinking about how to build with this federal network and how to work together with local governments, and instead dismantling entire social efforts, right? Social policy efforts. I think that to a great extent, regardless of the social policy that we talk about, whether it's security, whether it's social policy, a major obstacle that we're facing in Mexico for the more efficient implementation and expansion of policies is the level of polarization that we're facing today, Desmond. That today we're in a higher level of polarization that we even saw before in 2006, right? After that confrontation between the left and the right. Right now we have the allegedly left government, right, which doesn't really look into such as a leftist agenda after all the things that you, Mariano, and Rafael have shared before, right? That instead, this polarization is leading to the politicization of every single policy, and so the only bet that we can make is from the national government. Whatever the national government decides in terms of social policy, security policy, energy, right? We will probably be talking about the energy reform. That's part of how the bilateral relationship is shaping a lot, and Rafael will probably tell us more about it. But I think that I want to reiterate that what it's so surprising is that after having such a granular view, as you put it, Desmond, as a former candidate that had been visiting every single locality across the country, the view is now no longer at the local level. The view is still about the national level, because only the national level or the national view is what should prevail. And whatever is done at the local level, it might work out if there's some level of compatibility between the president and such politicians at the local level. Because that's not even something that we can say that happens across the country. We have a Morena governor in Puebla, and that's not an ally of the president, right? It's not that there has been a cooperation, and so to think about efficient policies that can be implemented. At the end, it's about, as Rafael was putting, it's about him and the national view that comes out from his vision.
Mm-hmm. So I want to work a little bit more on this vision, and I want to go back to Rafael initially about this, because this came up first from Rafael, which was this idea of the fourth transformation and the efforts that López Obrador is making to achieve this fourth transformation. And what I want to ask you about first here, Rafael, is can you explain to the audience kind of clearly what the fourth transformation is, what he's actually trying to achieve through the fourth transformation, and then beyond the broad question of substantively what it means, what does that mean for future practices of politics in Mexico, policymaking more generally in Mexico?
I mean, I just want to echo what Sandra said about polarization in Mexico. And since there's plenty of Americans in this room, I mean, this is very familiarized with you, because I believe that we Mexicans are almost as much polarized as you are as people is in the United States. It's different. I believe in the US is more about identities. It's conservatives and liberals. It's about minorities or the Obama coalition and those who are basically racists and they fear that very soon the whites are going to be the minority in the US. That is going to be in the year 2040. And in Mexico, I will say we have a polarization that has to do more with class, with where you are in the ladder of socioeconomic well-being. And you'll see an enormous polarization in Mexico. It's hard to talk to each other. And I believe that it's Mexicans with AMLO, they're in their own silo, and the critics of AMLO are in their own silo, and there's very little exchanges, positive exchanges there. That must be underlined because I believe that's the only way to understand what's going on now. Yes, López Obrador, he believes that he has the possibility to transform Mexico. He basically believes that he could have a movement like that one that created the Mexican independence from Spain, of the Mexican Revolution of 1910. I mean, he's someone who studies history, and he believes that this is the time for him to do his fourth transformation. And I would say this is really about nationalism. This is about, and energy is very important into this. It's about coming to the very important days in which Mexico at least felt that we were independent energy-wise. And so this is very, very important for him. And it's also about improving. He said that his government is for the poor people of Mexico, and primero los pobres, first the poor people. And but unfortunately, because of COVID, his government has had enormous setbacks. The level of poverty now in Mexico has increased. He is someone very special. He's a very complex character. He's not white, he's not black, he's complex, he's gray. Because he's a leftist who is very conservative in fiscal policy. He decided not to increase governmental expenditure at the worst time of the pandemic, that is the year 2020. And because of that, the Mexican economy is wrong about 9–10%. So I will say because of that, there's a lot of new, there's an increase of poverty in Mexico that nobody was really counting on. So I believe that he's getting increasingly frustrated because he's seen that his Cuarta Transformación is not happening, and then you see him opening more fights here and there, when he has done recently with Spain, where he has done recently with the European Parliament. Is basically that he's behaving like a populist. He's behaving as someone who needs to have an enemy in front, and I believe that the worst things will become for him. He will be more on the offensive side, and so this is what it is. I believe that the midterm election will basically create some difficulties for him, because yes, Morena won most of the governorships at stake, but he lost seats in Congress, which enables him to do an easy reforms, and that's why he's been having so much trouble in passing energy reform. This is something that, as Sandra was mentioning, could create a lot of push and backs with the US, but Desmond, it's very hard to, this is one of the complexities of López Obrador. I cannot still now understand why López Obrador does not like Biden. And he felt comfortable with Trump. It took him so long to come and congratulate Biden, it is very hard to understand. People were working for him as the former ambassador to Washington, Marta Bárcenas. I mean, he claims that he was so sure that Trump will be reelected that it took him a long time to recover. But it's some of those, I would say, gray issue areas in his personality, in his vision, that is hard to understand. I do believe that Biden aims well for Mexico. He has been the mature person in the relationship with López Obrador. López Obrador keeps on. I mean, he's been the Mexican president who has broken the golden rule after NAFTA, that is, do not politicize U.S.-Mexican relations because the U.S. is key for the well-being of Mexicans. Then López Obrador, man, he's attacking the U.S. off and on in La Mañanera, but you have a very mature Biden who listens what he wants to listen, because he understands very well that Mexico is a key ally for Mexico, and that's what he's trying to do. He sends his emissaries, for example, John Kerry, who is in charge of climate change. He has been in Mexico twice, and he's a very persuasive diplomat. He was Secretary of State, and so it's fascinating to observe, I will say, how Biden in this relationship has been the mature guy in the relationship. Let me stop here.
Thank you, Rafael. Mariano, I wanted to follow up on this question with you, ask you how you see the meaning of the fourth transformation, and to extend this question of the meaning of the midterm elections for understanding the directions of the López Obrador administration.
Sure. I mean, I think what does that fourth transformation mean? We can, one way of answering the question is, what does López Obrador, or programmatically, what does he mean when he speaks of the fourth transformation? And so, of course, it's trying to situate his movement in Mexican history and mark it as this landmark moment in the history of the country. And something important to is that in this periodization, so the first transformation is independence. The second transformation was the reform in the 19th century that separated church from state. Third transformation was the Mexican Revolution, and the fourth transformation is his coming to power, right? And it's important to notice there that, his coming to power is supposed to mark a break with the past. And so what is that past that we're breaking with? So for him is the adoption of market liberalism, or the neoliberal model, roughly starting in the early 80s, right, after the debt crisis. And so it's, for him, he's been open about his view of and his reading of Mexican history, and he's prone to speak in these historical terms. The democratic transition is erased from this landmark events, right? So for him and for his supporters, the discourse is the transition to neoliberalism was a period in which the state was captured by elite interests, by private interests, by the upper classes. And therefore, what we're witnessing with his coming to power is his trying to break with this special interests and to realign the state with the interests of the ordinary citizen. Now, that's what he means, broadly speaking. Now, if we start to go into the programmatic details of what the government is doing and what the policies concretely mean, I think it's, AMLO himself and the movement is full of contradictions. There is no programmatic, very little programmatic consistency. And this is not that exceptional. I think, these types of anti-establishment populist movements are seldom programmatically coherent. And I don't think it's the best way to understand its appeal in programmatic terms. It's a classic populist trying to break the left-right traditional axis of politics. Although, I mean, he situates himself on the left and he comes from the partisan left, but it's really trying to politicize a different axis of competition, the populist axis, the establishment against the ordinary people, the elite against the people. And that is not necessarily, does not map on exactly onto the left-right dimension. And in fact, he has toned down, I would say, many of the more things that, or policies that we would think or normally associate with the left. In fact, he has been quite conservative in social questions. I'm thinking of abortion, his treatment of the feminist movement. And he's always been personally conservative in those respects. He knows the public opinion is divided, and he has been, in environmental issues, he's definitely not on the left, right? On economic policy, the more traditional material aspect of the left-right axis of the left, we could say definitely at the core of his government and is this attempt to broaden social policy, to expand social programs. Now, and I'll say a bit more on that, but really, if we see in terms of the macroeconomic order, he has been incredibly hawkish, right? He came to power with an incredible democratic bonus. He could have, passed or at least tried to pass. He had a majority in Congress to pass a fiscal reform. Mexico is one of, as you may know, one of the weakest states in the region. Not only, even in regional standards for the Latin America region, in which states are not fiscally strong, they do not tax the rich. Mexico ranks at the bottom at the regional level, and he decided not to seek that path of a fiscal reform to really be able to expand government spending. He has been very hawkish and very conservative in that respect. During the pandemic, Mexico was one of the countries worldwide, not only again in the region, worldwide, that spent the least in trying to maintain the economy. So very pro-cyclical economic policy. So he has been very neoliberal in that respect. So there is little programmatic consistency, and I don't think that's the way that we should be trying to understand his appeal. So there's really, the meaning of the fourth transformation is very ambiguous. He's carrying out an anti-establishment mandate, and as part of that mandate, he has really taken on many of his institutions, but I would say not necessarily the economic establishment. So I would like to, there are some, it's true that he's politicized the relationship with the US, sometimes with economic interests, but really his attacks have been much more focused on cultural elites, on universities, on the media, on political opposition. But he's had very cozy relations with many of the businessmen that made their fortunes during the neoliberal era, right? Starting, for example, with Carlos Slim. So it's, although in principle, the fourth transformation means an end to crony capitalism and the separation of economic and political power, it seems like many other populist leaders, it's, as long as they are willing to play to the tune of the presidency, he's fine with his powerful economic interests. It's really about trying to restore the power of the presidency and to buttress his movement, right? And so I wanted to go back very quickly to something that Sandra mentioned, right? This idea of, how do we understand that AMLO, he praises himself of knowing every single corner of the country, of having traveled to every single municipality, and that's part of his appeal to ordinary people. I'm a man of the people, I'm one of you, I understand your concerns. And suddenly, when he's in power, he implements all these policies that really are, not only taking a very national view, but also that seem to undermine many of his campaign promises, especially with regards to security. Because let's remember that he didn't campaign. He campaigned saying, I'm going to take the military back to the barracks, and we cannot keep with this the war on drugs. And he really, in power, he has shifted and built this very strong alliance with the military, and we see the same, for example, with local movements that have opposed his large infrastructure projects. He has been really imposing this very centralist view, and it's a very centralist drive. And there are I would think, at least two ways to make sense of that. One is the part of his diagnosis of what's the problem and what has been the problem of Mexico in the past few decades. And it's this idea that Mexico faces major governance problems that he attributes to the weakening of the presidency, that the fragmentation of power has really undermined the ability of the state to respond to many governance challenges, and that therefore it's important for the executive to have all the tools in his hands. So that's maybe the part of the answer. And then there's also the more cynical answer that, of course, having powerful local governments, building local state capacities, having powerful governors, these are counterweights to his own power, and therefore he doesn't want that, right?
Thank you so much, Professor Sanchez. Professor Ley, I wanted to, Professor Sanchez just raised this question about the, violence in Mexico, the use of the military, responses to drug violence. President López Obrador has had some pretty marked rhetoric about kind of transforming the Mexican government's approach to the problem of criminal violence in that country. And I wanted to ask you about how you saw, if you could describe and how you evaluate President López Obrador's anti-crime, crime control, and violence control policies.
Yeah, so going back to your first question, Lisbon, I was going to say that if we want to talk about the direction that López Obrador has taken, and if we go specifically on security, I would go into the directions that López Obrador has not taken, given the discourse in the campaign, right? So there's a huge gap between the campaign discourse and actions, and that happens a lot of times, right? We have major words that have looked into those gaps, but I think that this was a very unexpected turn given the kinds of claims that were being done back then. So there was initially a conversation about transitional justice mechanisms, right? And that transition, that was an explicit question that civil society organizations made for López Obrador, thinking about the effort that had been done in CICIG, right, in Guatemala, that maybe this could be the opportunity to think about a transitional justice mechanism that had not been present in the Mexican democratic transition. López Obrador was initially open to that, right? He said that, yes, we can talk about a conversation with the UN. He even mentioned at some point talking to the Vatican, which, right, in this very odd conversation. But there was an opening that I think many victims and their relatives and human rights activists saw initially. And then all of a sudden that was lost. All of a sudden what we saw was instead a deeper militarization, expanded in different directions. Today we have, as I had mentioned before, a National Guard with mainly trained with trained militaries, right, that are now in charge of many more responsibilities than in the past two administrations, right? Going back to these gaps between discourse and actual implementation in the administration, the other idea that was emphasized over and over again was abrazos, no balazos, right? So thinking about in terms of perhaps thinking of social policy that could address the social origins or roots of crime. However, this had many flaws in terms of this wasn't really, first of all, a crime prevention policy, right? Which was something that Peña Nieto had attempted to do back in 2014, thinking about crime prevention efforts with many problems in terms of what crime prevention was, how crime prevention was being conceptualized and implemented at the end. But abrazos no balazos, right? The idea of, right, hugs, not bullets. It really didn't become a social policy to address crime. It was, as we have already discussed before, it is a social policy understood from the president's point of view, where women are out of the question, right? Where specific sectors that are not aligned with the government's interests or the idea of the fourth transformation are not going to be benefited in any way. Where the idea that initially was very controversial about perhaps giving some thinking of other ways that were not related to prison, right, and detention, right, for criminals, that was lost along the way, right? It wasn't at this point we cannot even speak of a social policy that addresses crime, because education funds, right, health funds have been dismantled in many directions. At the same time, what we had as an intelligence institution, CISEN, was dismantled too, right? Was changed also in its structure and the way that it worked. We're now with the military at the front of this new intelligence unit, which again reiterates the idea of a militarized approach for organized crime. And from this point of view, going back to my previous participation, this view from the national level disregarded completely the local logic of organized crime, but also the local necessities that different states and municipalities needed in this regard. As a result, what we have after the 2021 election was an even more violent election with high-profile attacks that have already reached Morena in terms of candidates and mayors that have been killed. The way that the government addressed this was having a series of 10 points that would broadly speak about the idea of investigating some of these politicians, their linkages, but that was never really a grounded policy, not even before the election. This was done just a few weeks before the election without further resources, as it has happened with many other policies in the administration. And so what we have today is that, first of all, López Obrador came into power benefiting from security. Analysis that I have done with Professor Melina Altamirano from Colegio, México, we find that López Obrador benefited from security, from the negative evaluations that Peña Nieto had received. Those benefited López Obrador for his election. But now in the 2021 election, what we found recently in work with Rodrigo Castro and Ulises Beltrán is that security violations and victims of crime, these are not key variables explaining the success of López Obrador. Security has sort of become lost in the way, with more priority for the economy, for health issues related to the pandemic. And I think that sort of reiterates sort of a blank check for the López Obrador administration in terms of disregarding the security agenda, because all this mobilization that at some point was present in 2018 has now been lost. I think that there is hope nonetheless with the level of mobilization that journalists and human rights activists continue to do, particularly the crisis today for journalism and freedom of speech in the country, and what that can mean for reputation if we go back to the works by Catalina Smulovitz, Enrique Perusotti, in thinking of societal accountability, of how key elements that could put pressure on shifting back to the fact that security is a crucial issue that this administration has continued to disregard and continues to follow a militarized strategy, even a more militarized than previous administrations had done. So in some way, the government has benefited from security, while at the same time expanding insecurity a lot more during this past 4 years.
Thank you. I wanted to follow up on one point you made, which was you said that President López Obrador excludes women from certain types of conversations or certain types of participation. I didn't quite get the point you were making. I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on that.
Thank you, Desmond, because I think that's another point that could begin to shift also the discussion in 2024, as I said, regarding the journalists, but also about women. The level of mobilization that women have reached in this administration has been notable because the level of violence against women has risen significantly. Feminicides are on the rise, and as a consequence, today we face sort of the highest levels of mobilization just a few weeks ago, up in Mexico City, with tens of thousands of women that marched throughout the main avenue of Mexico City, showing a discontent, about the way that not only that violence has risen, but also about the way that López Obrador has dealt with this issue of violence against women. Disregarding violence minimizing the issue. But even perhaps more aggravating is the fact that when confronted with these demands by women, asking for greater security, asking for him to have specific policies to address this issue, the response has been, as Mariano and Rafael have referred, to say that these are women that are neoliberal, right? That have become, that are being managed by other interests, right? That only wish to affect his administration, instead of paying attention to the fact that this is definitely an issue that has been on the rise in Mexico, but it has been increasing significantly now with the pandemic. And that's not even limited to his administration in Mexico. This is a phenomenon that we have seen across the world, right? Violence against women has been rising, and not even within from that perspective, López Obrador has been able to acknowledge the acute situation that the administration today faces in terms of the violence that women face, and being able to see that there would be so many allies, right, that he could have. Along with that, I think that another grievance that has been shared by women towards the administration, and I know that Rafael already said that this is a president that doesn't govern with his cabinet, but an important point to make about the cabinet was that initially the idea was this was a cabinet that had the highest number of women, right, within the cabinet, but those women have been sort of blurred, right, or have been moved, right, in these positions. So reiterating the idea that his commitment to the issues that women are raising is not real, and is not sincere, right?
Thank you, Professor Ley. So Professor Fernández de Castro, I had a bunch of questions I wanted to ask about foreign policy, probably too many for us to cover in one question, but I'm going to put them out there and give them to you, and give you the opportunity to answer the ones you think are most important. So you've already discussed somewhat about the bilateral relations between U.S. and Mexico, and President López Obrador's kind of general level of comfort with Trump. But you also mentioned broadly his kind of reactions to Europe, his kind of a little bit of pushback against Europe, and I think I wanted you to explore that a little bit. I also wanted you to explore a little bit about his relationships with other countries in Latin America, particularly perhaps Venezuela or other countries that are in difficult straits politically.
Thank you, Desmond. Let me start by saying something about U.S.-Mexico security cooperation. As expected, okay, when AMLO came, because Sandra was talking about that, and I believe this is going to be a key legacy of López Obrador, because I do believe that he's basically looking the other way. As Calderón was, I would say, I mean, he couldn't. He was obsessed with security-related issues. I would say AMLO does not want really to get into this, and that will leave an awful legacy for him. But as expected, he basically blamed the Merit Initiative. He basically, as being a tool organized by Calderón and George W. Bush, and so he kept on blaming the Merit Initiative. And just finally, in the last few weeks, they come up with what is called the bicentennial agreement, in which it's like it's a very small Merit Initiative. It's so what I want to say here, Desmond, is that there's no ambition in the level of cooperation on security with the U.S. It's nowadays it's very low, the amounts of resources we get in from the U.S. and at the beginning of the Merit Initiative, approximately almost $500 million were coming in aid from the U.S. to Mexico, and nowadays it's around $70 million. So it's much rather small. Not only that, but when you see the level of people, of U.S. policymakers dealing with Mexico, I mean, basically the coordinator of this effort. Hold on a second, there's someone doing a lot of noise. Always someone doing the grass in California. So I just shot the. So again, there's no ambition in who is handling security in Washington. And for example, Calderon, he was very adamant. He very much wanted people at the cabinet level in Washington to be dealing with Mexico because, and that's why he thought about, initially when we were thinking about the Merit Initiative, he wanted the US to transfer to Mexico $1 billion a year. And because he thought that that was the only way in which very high level officials would put attention into Mexico. Nowadays, I mean, the level of cooperation in Mexico has diminished tremendously. And I will say, again, Desmond, I believe the single most important problem in US-Mexico bilateral cooperation on security-related issues is the lack of alignment. Mexico wants A and the US wants B. So the US, in a way, continues to be about interdiction, especially now that fentanyl, the synthetic heroin, has become very detrimental for Americans. Let's not forget that last year, almost 100,000 Americans died because of overdoses, mostly of opioids. And so there's an enormous crisis in the US about opioids. And then in Mexico, we have an enormous crisis of murders, of killings. And I would say, but there's very little understanding of this. And I don't see, and for example, one of the things in which the Mexican Foreign Ministry has been very adamant to raise in the agenda is the smuggle of arms into Mexico. I believe this started by the shooting in El Paso, in which was a crime against Mexicans, a crime against Latinos, the first shooting against Latinos. And I will say that the Mexican foreign minister was very savvy, very smart politically. Immediately he flew to El Paso. And he has made a very important item on the US-Mexico agenda to try to stop the flow of arms coming from the US. I will say it's important. I'm glad he's doing it. Unfortunately, I don't think this is going to be very efficient because the US has an enormous problem about arms. And if the US cannot control arms in its own territory, much less is going to help Mexico on this. So I believe that it's fine that we're trying to do that, but I don't think this is going to benefit us a lot. So in terms of immigration, Desmond, I will say here is when you can tell that there's been the single most important misunderstanding here, because basically out of goodwill, Biden, in changing the narrative and saying, when I will become president, migrants will be welcome, we will help you. Just by changing the narrative, that created a crisis in the US-Mexico border. And that crisis has been very costly to Biden in terms of politics, because of course the Republicans were badly attacking him. You're weak on the border issues. We need the man of the wall. So we're missing Trump. And I will say that has become a very important vulnerability for Biden. What we're seeing right now is that Biden and his team, they basically becoming very harsh on immigration-related issues. They reinstated the migration protection protocols, and I will say that is out of political need. We all knew that it was last year in which the U.S. Could be able to pass immigration reform. It didn't happen, and this year that there's a midterm election, of course. I would say the White House has become much more. He is there to enforce the law, and all of that sympathy toward flows you're not seeing and not listening to that from the White House. So it's basically a harshening of the U.S. of the White House posture or positioning on migration-related issues. So I believe that now with the war in Europe, with the Russian invasion to Ukraine, I will say that there's going to be less tolerance with Mexico, and I believe that the U.S. is very busy right now. Again, Desmond, I would say we're going back to those years of the worst years of the Cold War, in which the U.S. was fairly negligent towards Mexico. I'll see that happening. I mean, it cuts both ways, because we saw Secretary of Homeland Security Anthony Mayorkas coming to Mexico in the last few days, basically to make sure that Mexico and the U.S. were fully cooperating now that there's difficult times in the world. So, I mean, this is fascinating. The Biden administration understands how important is Mexico for its own security of the U.S., how important is Mexico for controlling the flows coming from the Mexican southern border and those landing into Mexico. But at the time, I would say there's less tolerance, because the U.S. is having a midterm election, because there's war on Europe, and because everybody in Washington is fairly consumed by what's happening in world affairs. And so, again, we'll see a little bit of more intolerance from Washington, and as well a little bit of more negligence towards Mexico.
So we're getting through some of the time on our panel, and we'd like to eventually turn to question and answer from the audience. We have one question in the inbox, and I'll be asking it in a little bit. I want to go through another round of questions with the panel. But if anybody has any questions, please send them to the chat box, and then I will ask them from there. Professor Sanchez, I wanted to come back to you and talk about the prospects for democratic stability in Mexico. In particular, I wanted to ask you about two separate questions. The first is the implications of the reduction in funding to the National Electoral Institute for democratic stability, for the elections generally. And also I wanted to ask you about civil-military relations, right, and how they've been evolving under the López Obrador administration.
Sure. On the question of INE and in general their relation with election management, so I think it's fairly can predict, and we're not very good at prediction and political science, but I do think that we can anticipate that AMLO is going to double down on his attacks on INE that has been going on and has continuing. The question in the chat is about the referendum, the coming referendum to potentially revoke his presidential mandate. And during this process, AMLO has been very vocal against INE. And so I think that is deemed to continue. There's this very active effort to delegitimize INE as an independent election management body, and coupled with these austerity cuts that have been really weakening INE's administrative capacities. Now, I do think that INE has some real strength in two senses. I mean, real strength in the basic institutional administrative sense. It's one of the, I would say, very few but very effective state institutions, and it's built over time a reputation more broadly in Mexican society. So when we look at public opinion and trust in institutions, despite these attacks, despite the very polarized rhetoric, INE retains a majoritarian respect among the public. And I think that that's important to keep in mind, because it does pose at least some limit to the ability of López Obrador to single-handedly, take over the institution. Now, that said, there are real risks. And I think that what we're seeing now with the referendum is, there's this process of trial and error where the administration, attacks INE and sees what sticks, how far they can go. López Obrador is now, actively intervening in the process. Other political elites, other Morena elites, just approved in Congress a piece of legislation that essentially tries to supersede electoral law, saying that they are allowed to participate in the campaign. And so we're likely to see this ahead of the 2024 elections, but there are some important landmarks in the process. So it's going to be important to see the outcome of there are 6 elections at the state level for governorship this year. There's one next year that is important. And it's also important to consider, that right now, I think INE has done a very good job at trying to protect its autonomy and drawing the lines with the presidency in a very hostile environment. But many of the consejeros, of the councilors in INE's governing body are going to be renovated in 2023. So before the presidential elections, including Lorenzo Córdoba, the current president of INE. And so it's going to be very important to focus on, I think it's 4 of them that's going to be renovated. So, the majority of the General Council of INE's General Council is now going to be appointed under the Moreno administration. Now, they are appointed in Congress by a 2/3 majority, which means that the opposition has a veto power, so Moreno cannot control it or just appoint loyalists. But based on the pattern that we've seen with other institutions, that's going to be a critical moment to see or to try to understand what's coming for the 2024 election. So the renovation of INE, and something that it's important to be very attentive in what follows. And so on the second issue of civil military relations, there's massive, I do think that there's been a very important qualitative change. This is something that did not start, of course, with López Obrador, this process of the growing political influence of the military, the role in public security, but increasingly in other realms of policy that have little to do with security. And so what we're seeing under López Obrador, and this is, I think, really concerning, is an increasing economic role for the military. So kind of making them an economic corporation in a way that is involved in very different projects, from infrastructure projects, building the airport, being the Maya train in the Southern Peninsula, the disbursement of social programs. So, and what this is creating in many ways is an embedded interest for the military in many of the flagship programs of the administration. So it's a way of trying to sort of institutionalize in essentially a partisan political project as part of the state itself, and removing it, putting it outside the bounds of regular democratic partisan competition. Whoever comes to power next, regardless of whether it's a Morena president or from the opposition, they will have to contend with this fact that the military now have an embedded interest in the continuity of these projects, that they have they control a larger size of the economic pie through these programs, and that they're entering into these relations with economic agents. Now it's the rise of the military as an economic agent that is concerning, and also the politicization of the armed forces, right? I think AMLO has been it's a symbiotic relationship in which the military have been asking for some legal coverage to their participation in public security. And so they finally obtained that through the National Guard and other measures. And also, let's keep in mind that, levels of institutional trust in Mexico are incredibly low in many institutions. And it is still the fact that the military is one of the most respected institutions in Mexico. And so it's, I would say, rational for political actors to try to, identify or develop a close relationship with the military to try to capitalize upon some of that prestige. And it's very tragic because we know the evidence really points to, how bad it is for human rights and the involvement of the military in public security, how ineffective it is. But at the same time, it's one of those policies in which there tends to be majoritarian support. And so AMLO, I think that in part explains his why he essentially engaged in bait and switch in this issue, and also about the growing veto power of the military. And so this is really thinking in long term, one of the perhaps more perverse legacies that we may see from this administration, right? This different role of the military that's going to be very difficult to roll back. And final point that I would mention, and about the prospects of democratic stability. So Ken Green at UT Austin and I wrote this piece for the Journal of Democracy a few months ago, saying, essentially making the argument that, and I think there's some to that, and we've been pointing about, the growing power of the presidency and the threat, and I think this is real. It's something to take seriously, but I think it's also important to recognize the limits to the ability of López Obrador to build a hegemonic supermajoritarian movement. I mean, there are real governance challenges in Mexico that have not been solved. If we think about the economy, if we think about poverty, if we think about security, it's very difficult to argue that there's been meaningful progress in any of these arenas. Levels of poverty are higher than at the beginning of the administration. Homicide rates continue peaking. The pandemic was incredibly mishandled. And so in the real issues, I would say there's been little progress. The situation in the following years is going to be very difficult economically. And so, and part of it has to do with, structural deficiencies and structural weaknesses in the Mexican state that in part, López Obrador was very good at capitalizing upon with his anti-establishment rhetoric. But at the same time, in power, I think his administration has been very incompetent in many ways. And I mean this in the basic in the daily task of governing. It's shown very little skill. And in part, this has to do with, his privileging of loyalty over competence. We've seen the dismantling of institutional capacities and this is very concerning. This is, I think, one of the other perverse legacies that we're going to see, and we're going to see the effects playing out in the next several years of how, in the health system, if we look at the environmental regulation agencies, in many different spheres of the state, we've seen further weakening of institutional capacities, and therefore it's very difficult to sustain a high levels of electoral support with lackluster performance in government. And I think that, perhaps paradoxically, it's of course not good news for democracy, for the quality of democracy, that these governance issues are essentially unsolvable. But at the same time, it's difficult to think of of Morena becoming this kind of super majoritarian hegemonic force that is going to dominate the electoral field for years to come.
Okay, and before we turn to the audience questions, we now have a few. I wanted to ask Professor Fernández de Castro one more question, which was, I wanted you maybe to talk a little bit about the posture of the López Obrador administration to higher education and academic research. As you probably know, the Latin American Studies Association has had a referendum on a statement on what had the legal case at CONACYT, and I'm wondering if you could perhaps reflect a little bit on this and share with our audience what you know about these dynamics.
Desmond, perhaps Sandra might be better situated than me to answer that because she teaches at CIDE, and I'm in California. And but this is what I could say. I believe that he attacks some universities because he believes that they train technocrats and they train neoliberal people, professionals, and to me it's hard to understand why he has attacked in such a way CIDE, and but he's basically destroying CIDE as much as he can, and it again is hard to understand. He has also attacked the National University of Mexico, UNAM. I believe on that. I see a political purpose. Next year there's going to be, they will select the new president of the university, and perhaps López Obrador wants to get immersed in handling who's going to be the new rector. And he kept on attacking ITAM, the institution that I worked for 20-something years, and that's my alma mater. And but I understand that's easy to understand because ITAM was basically the bedrock of Mexican technocrats and neoliberals. mostly, I would say, the economists who have run the country in the last 25 years, most of them, they have been educated at TAM, few of them in Syria lately. And well, he blames neoliberal policies. To him, that is the sin we have committed, and his fourth transformation is about making sure that these neoliberal policies are not do not run Mexico anymore. And I believe that it's often known. He mentions that he blames people who study overseas, and often known he says that one comes here and then we become corrupt. And but I believe this is his attacks on neoliberalism, and but I will say it's very contradictory. It's hard to understand, and I can really understand why he has focused so much on CIDE, and because it's CIDE for the last 20 years was a wonderful small institution who decided to be a sort of between Colegio de Mexico and ITAM, that it's training very well people, pushing students very hard to become very competitive, world standards, and they were doing a wonderful job on that, and suddenly he decided to just start these attacks that and he in a way manipulated of his government, and now there's a new director at CIDE that obviously shouldn't be there, and it's very sad to see how this institution that for the last 20 years was able to produce cut-edge research on the violence, on economics, and a few other topics, it's certainly under the attacks of the president. I will say it's he's way too powerful to go against an institution like CIDE, and but it is what it is, and I believe CIDE is suffering enormous consequences because of that, and I will say higher education is suffering because of that.
I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Sandra, or if we should go on to the questions in the chat box.
Yeah, I think I would just add to say that this is I appreciate the empathy with the CIDE community, but it's so much broader, as you put it, Desmond, with in general with science and higher education. This has started early in the López Obrador administration, where academics were equated as public servants. So that means many new fiscal responsibilities and implications. On the one hand, it meant losing medical insurance. It also it has meant that the dismantling of public trust that made research possible. And what happened at CIDE just last year is just one case that had already been happening before. The difference with CIDE is that we have been more vocal. It's social science, so there's a lot more op-eds that are written from professors at CIDE. So that changed sort of the game. But this had the way that the higher education institution was able to insert itself at CIDE was just the way that has been happening in other places. And this has meant, in very blunt terms, not having resources, not being paid, removing key professors, openly threatening professors about not criticizing the government. That was explicitly told by the new director at CIDE, to not criticize the government, because otherwise nothing would be we would not get paid, right? So those are the kinds of things that are happening, and that's sort of the same discourse that we just are seeing, the reflection of those mañaneras happening at the very local and immediate context in academic institutions.
Okay, thank you so much, Sandra. So now we have some questions in the inbox, which are not directed to any of you in particular. So I will put it out there, and whoever wants to take the question should go ahead and do that. The first question comes from Pamela Scheinman, And she asks, please comment on the April vote on renovación of the on the revocation, excuse me, of the presidential mandate, which raises constitutional issues about legality and problems of succession. What are the consequences of this?
I'll take the question. And yeah, as you know, so in the April 10, there's going to be this revocation of mandate referendum, and it's very likely that what we're going to see is a very high percentage of the population saying, yeah, we want the president to stay. But at the same time, very low participation. And this has been, I would say, a classic example of this direct democracy mechanisms that could potentially complement representative democracy, but instead of being promoted from the bottom up and being really this autonomous instrument for citizen participation to control governing elites and to increase the input of everyday citizens into the process, it's been really appropriated by the government. And so it's really the government, it's kind of paradoxical, but it's the government campaigning for this referendum not to revoke the mandate of the president, right? And so it's very clear an effort to show some organizational muscle and to keep this idea of the almost, I would say, instinctive, or the identification, the direct identification of the president with the people. And we've seen this in other populist regimes. Now, I think that the difference here is that, again, participation is likely to be low. We've seen some of these exercises before. The referendum on whether ex-presidents should be investigated for corruption happened the same thing, very low participation. And so it's difficult, I think, for the AMLO administration to really claim a lot of credit for them. And so in that respect, I don't think it's going to be a decisive political event. But at the same time, it is a way of firing up the base of keeping the polarization and keeping the confrontation with the opposition alive. And I think that something that, going back to the polarization, I think it's important to try to really understand why is it that, the president is every day in his morning press conferences intentionally stoking polarization and building this climate of a very confrontational type of politics. And, in some way, we could think it's a way of compensating for underperformance. It's a way of raising the costs of defection, both at the voter level and also at the political elite level. So AMLO at this point and ahead of the 2024 elections, I think it's very important to keep in mind that Morena is a very weakly institutionalized party. There's definitely some level of identification in the electorate, but it's mostly concentrated on AMLO's person. It's a very personalistic party. And it doesn't have the institutional mechanisms that parties do to solve the conflict. So this means that it's the president himself who is doing the coalition management, and polarization is a way of trying to, I think, contain elite defection. And therefore, I think this is going to be part of that, of this idea of the opposition is intrinsically corrupt, is evil, and therefore it's raising the stakes of crossing the axis, right? But the nature of the polarization is really not necessarily ideological, and I think one of the things that's been striking to me is how polarized things have gotten, really, especially at the political elite level. I don't think there's some evidence of rising polarization also at the mass level in the electorate, but it's really more at the level of political elites and commentators and pundits. But when one looks at policy disagreements, I mean, there's policy disagreement and there are programmatic differences, but we're not seeing, I mean, this is not a very radical government in terms of policy. I mean, they're not nationalizing anything. They're not, dismantling USMCA. They are maintaining the neoliberal model, the core elements of the neoliberal model, if you want. So it's really not the ideological polarization itself, it's more the affective polarization, very much like in the United States, right? And So I would end with that. So there's the attacks on CIDE, on academia, on universities. It's part of, it's not isolated, and it's part of this broader phenomenon that I think we're seeing in Mexico, but also elsewhere, and which, you know, politics is becoming much more angry. And what worries me is really that it's part of, you know, a broader, I would say, manipulation of truth and disregard for science, disregard for expertise. And that's something that, you know, can be effective in terms of maintaining certain loyalties, but at the same time, of course, it's incredibly undermining for the performance of the government.
Okay, thank you so much, Mariano. This next question, I think, probably goes to Sandra. It says, it's asked by Alejandro Alvarado. He writes, Mexico is one of the most insecure countries in the world, or the worst, to practice journalism. 8 journalists have been killed this year. The government has done nothing. Why?
Well, thanks to Alejandro for his question. In a very simplified way, my answer to why is because journalists are doing their job. Because journalists have been a key accountability mechanism. Going back to the societal accountability concept, right? That investigative journalism in Mexico for a long time, but more so in this administration, given all that we have shared in this panel, have been doing a lot of work showing all the problems with public policy that is being implemented in Mexico, the biases that it has, the problems that it has, the corruption that it has revealed, right? So, of course, there are particular journalists that López Obrador has in mind all the time, right? When he makes all the generalizations about journalism and investigative journalism specifically, the work, because of all the confrontations that he has had with specific characters in national politics. But also, I think that something that López Obrador has benefited from in terms of those attacks against journalists is that, as it has happened under other administrations too, is that he has been able to say, to delegate some of these issues for local governments, for state governments, right? That is something that local governments have to deal with because that happened under that jurisdiction, right? So that's another problem. The attribution of responsibility that he's able to play around in, again, going back again to those mañaneras. And I think that mañaneras have been very dangerous and hurting to our democracy because the president sets that agenda and then we go back to, we stay with those topics for the rest of the day when there are so many more things that are happening. And at the same time, I think that another answer to this why question that Alejandro poses is that in a major issue with this topic is the way that not only about how they can make attributions to other governments, but how they have been able to criminalize journalists, right? About their collusion, the links with other politicians. I think that's another way which López Obrador has been able to play around with this issue. I think that there's hope with the level of mobilization that journalists have reached before and now, having networks that extend throughout the country to put this up front. But I think that a challenge that journalists are facing today in the country, as probably many other sectors in the country, is that those mechanisms that were available for them to protect themselves, the mechanism, right, for the protection of journalists and active human rights activists in Mexico, they have continued to be dismantled and with no resources, right? So that was a problem that past administration had been facing, but today it's even more evident, right? And a key character in national politics, Alejandro Encinas, for the Human Rights Office, that is linked with the Ministry of the Interior in the current administration. A major problem is that this office has not really had sort of the political power to actually have, right, all this communication, coordination, negotiation, and resources, right, to address this and other issues that are related to security and human rights. because that's not the priority of this government, right? And I would go back to the fact that journalists are doing their job so well that it has been affecting the reputation of the government to such a degree that it has even reached, right, international main pages of major newspapers. And that's something that the president does react on mañaneras and throughout every single speech, and that's something that really makes him upset. And to that extent is that I think he's not willing to find any way to talk, because the entire speech is in terms of generalizations that we have said before, and generalizing the way that he sees journalism in just having a relationship with some few journalists that are going to publish and are going to say only positive things about his agenda, whether it's the airport, right, and having a documentary made only for that, right, or talking about his new energy project, right? So those are the things that he's able to work to say about journalism, and the rest, in this populist point of view, is not worth, right, his time, and it's not worth paying attention at all.
Thank you, Sandra. This next question, it comes from Andres Besser, and probably should go to Rafael. It says, can you talk about the episode with General Cienfuegos? Does the fact that the Department of Justice dropped all charges mean that Mexico has a degree of leverage on the US? If so, what are the sources of this leverage? Does this episode show that AMLO is weak vis-a-vis the military?
Thank you, Desmond. And Andres, this is a very important question, but just let me add something of what Sandra just said about the journalists in Mexico. I will say that we have seen, I mean, when we were listening to López Obrador criticizing journalists like Carlos Loret de Mola at the height of these moments in which everybody was very worried about the number of journalists being killed in Mexico this year, because there's already 8. I mean, this really shows a lack of connection of López Obrador with what's important, and I believe that happens to presidents, Desmond. I mean, throughout the years, they become sort of a lonely people. I mean, they start listening to people, to experts, to their own cabinet members, and to me, this is the case of López Obrador. I mean, it was insane that he was blaming the Secretary of State just the day before Russia was going to invade Ukraine. So he was looking at these things in Mexico that are important for him, but much less important for the world, when the world was basically in one of the most difficult moments in the last 80 years or so. So it really shows the disconnect of López Obrador with what's going on in the world, and it's scary that he seems very isolated in his own palace. Andres, it is hard to say. I mean, there's a lot of. I would say I don't know, but this is what I believe. This is because it's hard to have the. I mean, there's people who knows about this, and I'm just speculating. But my speculation is the following. First of all, I believe that yes, as Mariano just said, the military has become very close to López Obrador. They're very powerful. And of course, they didn't like what happened to Cienfuegos. And of course, they lobbied López Obrador for pressure in the US. And then my take on this is that this is something that it was not known by the White House. I doubted that this went all the way to the White House. Remember that Trump was not a very good coordinator of policy. He was like López Obrador, someone who didn't care about the deep state. And so I believe that what I have heard and what I believe is that this was something like, a lack of coordination. The DEA decided to do this, to put this in place, to basically apprehend Cienfuegos. And as always, there's a lack of coordination in the US. There's many agencies, they're not very disciplined. off and on they follow their own vision, and I believe that that allow Mexico to be effective in getting back Cienfuegos. But of course, it shows the strength of the military in Mexico. But I would say that, and perhaps a lack of coordination in the U.S. And we will see. But this is a very, I would say, important episode in the U.S.-Mexico security cooperation, and it's yet to be discovered what really happened there, and we will not know anytime soon. But eventually, when we could open those archives, we will find out what happened. So far, I believe that was a lack of coordination in the U.S. and the strength of the military in Mexico.
Thank you, Rafael. So well, our time is running out. I wanted to, there's one last question. I'm going to put it to Mariano first, but I also wanted to ask Mariano to add any closing remarks that he might have about the direction of that he sees Mexico going in the coming years. So this question comes from Osvaldo Mena. He says, social spending has been shown to be regressive, and social spending on infrastructure has been dismantled through austerity and cuts instead of cash transfers. Is it analytically useful to consider the government as left-wing?
Thank you, Desmond. Thank you, Osvaldo, for the question. I think, in fact, Osvaldo himself wrote a nice piece yesterday in El País, explaining how contradictory the policies are in the AMLO administration with regards to poverty and the socioeconomic policy in general, and he was pointing rightly to I think one of the, if we wanted to identify the successes of the AMLO administration, or what in my opinion has been done well, I think on labor issues there's been some change, and part of this is important to understand that USMCA now has labor clauses, and some part of the pressure from the United States has been changing labor-business relations in Mexico, and there's something going on in there in terms of the potential democratization of unions. On that end, I think the administration has been fairly more progressive than previous administrations, for sure. And the increases in the minimum wage, which are easy to disregard, as the minimum wage was so low that there was a lot of room for improvement. But it's something that we could clearly say, this is a leftist policy, trying to increase labor income at the bottom, and that I think the data I've seen has been fairly positive in terms of its effects without any negative consequences. Now, Osvaldo was pointing to the contradiction between this increases in the minimum wage with a combination of austerity cuts in every other arena of social policy, and the distribution of cash transfers that, from what we know, and this is something that we should comment it with a grain of salt, because the data, one of the issues with social policy is that it's much less transparent than it was in the past. Not that social policies and cash transfers were perfect before the AMLO administration, but now programs are distributed based on a census that has not been made public, and that was fielded by servants of the nation, essentially Morena party activists. So it's hard to know what's going on in social policy, but the best data that we have from the National Statistics Agency point to a slight expansion in the degree of coverage, but at the same time, much less efficient targeting, which means that the cash transfers are being much more regressive, in the sense that they are not reaching the very poor. Instead, they are going to more of the middle classes, and even people in the upper middle classes, right? So there's less targeting. So you're trying to improve or raise the living standards of the poor. The minimum wage contributes to that, but at the same time, the cash transfers are being less effective, less well targeted to the poor. And I would say, on top of that, many of the programs are being financed through austerity cuts in very sensitive areas like health provision, health services, the education reform, which is something that we haven't touched upon, but there's very education policy, there's really been a very little improvement. There's major issues in there. So in terms of the broader public goods provision of the state is very aggressive. We're going to see again the effects playing out in the medium run, but therefore it's difficult, I would say, to sort of identify or clearly say that this is a government that has been pursuing a coherent center-left or leftist agenda, in the sense that it's very hawkish and very conservative in terms of fiscal reform, not raising taxes, austerity cuts in very important social services, and therefore I think I see very little consistency there. And finally, I would say, for final remarks and what is coming, we haven't talked that much about the dynamics in the party system, and of course, the future of democracy. It's very difficult to talk about democracy and democratic stability without talking about parties and balance of power in the party system and how the party system has been changing. And I think there's a very clear effort on the part of the AMLO administration to try to realign electoral competition and realign the party system in a more of a two-block system, instead of the traditional three large parties that we've had since democratization. His rhetoric, his populist rhetoric, is very aimed at trying to split the electorate in half, since liberals against conservatives, us versus them, and whether he's going to be successful or not, it's hard to tell. I do think that there is some evidence that this is taking root, and something to keep in mind. And I think that that makes me fairly optimistic. I don't know if naively optimistic. I hope not. But apart from the governance issues and the poor economic performance, poor performance and security that I think are going to be very difficult for the government to maintain high levels of support, or at least to become a hegemonic authoritarian force, it's that there's a strong civil society in Mexico, and Sandra and Rafael were pointing to this. At the local level, there are local movements that I think there's now a democratic tradition in Mexico. There's for sure an authoritarian tradition that is very well represented in the government, but there's really a democratic tradition, a more organized civil society, a more vigilant press. And I think the feminist movement, as we've commented before, has really outflanked the government on the left and is very active. So I think there's antibodies at the social level. At the level of the party system, the opposition is certainly weakened, but we have not seen the total collapse of opposition parties. They're still there. They're able, not necessarily to mobilize a lot of active support or with a lot of enthusiasm, but there's the real concern among, I would say, broad segments of Mexican society about the direction of the country. And so there's going to be a lot of retrospective voting that is going to be, and we've seen that in the midterms already. Segments, especially the more educated segments of the middle class in Mexico City, for example, that had been traditionally a stronghold of the left, now started to vote more with the opposition. And so I think that Morena for sure has the potential to become a large party with solid support, but at the same time, I do think that the balance of power in the party system can maintain the democratic game alive, even though it's certainly being very stressed right now.
Thank you so much, Mariano. So Sandra, I just wanted to give you the opportunity for any final reflections on the direction of democracy in Mexico.
So I know that this, as when we talk about security, and I know that everyone in the panel understands that we end up on a very depressing note usually, right? And we wonder how can we keep going with these research agendas. For me, the hope, as I said before, is on the way that new organizations have been able to articulate and build networks amongst themselves to resist, to raise their voices. The attacks that horizontal checks and mechanisms of societal accountability have faced, I think that nonetheless have also shown the power and the strength that INE, academics, journalists, right, even the Supreme Court, can still have, right, in the face of autocratic measures. I think that there's newfound resistance at networks. Of course, the question is how long can they last, right? And how long can they last if resources are failing, if grievances are accumulating? But I think that there has been a lot of learning through the use of judicial tools that have been made available, that have been used with more intensity by civil society in Mexico. And I think that for me remains hopeful, that despite so many grievances that have accumulated, and despite how tired many of the sectors already are about raising their voice over and over and again, I think that at the end, this has been able to build strong networks that I still remain hopeful that can activate in 2024 and can open new opportunities. The opposition seems weak nonetheless, right? At this point, we cannot really think of an opposition candidate that looks right, that seems that building some strength, right, and power for in a couple of years from now. We'll see what happens after April 10th, as Mariano was saying. But I think that we're having new opportunities to participate, to articulate, to inform ourselves. And to that extent, I still remain hopeful for 2024, that despite the way that democracy has been going down, some checks, some accountability mechanisms are still available. And I think that Mexicans are taking as much advantage as possible, exploiting those mechanisms to avoid a major backlash against democracy in Mexico.
Thank you, Sandra. And I wanted to turn last to Rafael and ask him about his reflections on future developments in politics in Mexico.
Thank you, Desmond. And it's been wonderful to share this webinar with Sandra and with Mariano. And let me just say that I believe we should try to get some lessons out of the US. I believe that the US democracy, that it's at stake. And we have always, in the past, basically the US inspired us to become more democratic. And now we should really get some lessons of the US. What went wrong with the US? I believe that the US was unable in the last decades to improve and to reform the electoral system. The US does not have a central authority, which is a big mistake. And the Electoral College, which it has become a myth. Yes, it's wonderful, but it's not functional anymore. So I believe that now that we Mexicans, that we do have a central authority, we have INE, we should respect INE, we should make sure that INE continues to be there. They know how to do things. And we know that a major improvement of Mexico has been to have this central and citizen organization, which is INE, and I believe that we should protect it. We know that it's under fight from López Obrador, but we have to protect it. And I do believe that, I hope I'm wrong, but I'm going to be pessimistic in this. I believe one of the most important lasting legacies of López Obrador, he's weakening civil society and philanthropy in Mexico. And he's doing that because he wants to, again, get power in the hands of the president. He doesn't want intermediaries to get into society. So that's wrong. But again, I believe that we have to learn from the US, and it's worrisome how polarizes the US, and we basically transiting in that direction. This is still not that bad, but again, this is a time for us to look and reflect what's going on in the US and try to avoid the mistakes done by the US. Thank you, Desmond.
Thank you so much, Rafael. And I just wanted to thank all of our panelists, Sandra Ley, Mariano Sanchez, and Rafael Fernández de Castro for their participation today and their support of the Bildner Center. And I wanted to also thank the audience for your attendance. Thank you so much, and look out for future webinars that we'll be having this semester.